Is there any hope of peace between Israel and Palestine? Should we rip up the planning system? And are the so-called culture wars exaggerated? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Bob Seely, Labour frontbencher Baroness Chapman, former government advisor Salma Shah and Nancy Fielder, editor of the National World newspaper group. On the programme, Gaza sees some of the most intense airstrikes since the start of the conflict as the United States steps up diplomatic efforts.
As we're engaged in pursuing humanitarian pause, this can be something that advances the prospect of getting the hostages back.
We'll speak to an Israeli man whose parents were killed in last month's attack. He says he wants to see peace, not revenge.
Mark my words, Britain needs this King's Speech to kick-start a big build.
Keir Starmer wants tomorrow's King's Speech to bulldoze through the planning system and get more homes built. Is he right?
A man is a man and a woman is a woman. That's just common sense.
Lines like that are popular in the Conservative Party, but what do the public make of the so-called culture wars?
There is no need to use tents for accommodation in 21st century Britain.
And the Home Secretary says many people are living on the streets in tents as a lifestyle choice. Well, let's start with that story you just heard there with the Home Secretary. You can see the Telegraph headline, "Homeless people in tents have made a lifestyle choice," says Braverman. She's planning to ban tents, it's been reported, being used by homeless people for accommodation in town centres, saying that some, sleeping rough, have done so as a lifestyle choice. The measures are expected to be part of a new criminal justice bill, which will be unveiled in the King's Speech tomorrow, which is when the government sets out its legislative programme for the coming year. At the state opening of Parliament, you can watch that on BBC One at 10:30, and then, of course, we'll be covering it here on Politics Live. But my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Bob Seely, is it a lifestyle choice for some people living in tents on the streets?
I think for a small minority it may well be. Homelessness is a significant problem. And I think it is one of the most depressing things that one sees day to day. The government has a £2 billion programme to support local authorities to ease the issues with homelessness. And we now have a £200 million programme called SHAP, which is a single housing accommodation, homeless accommodation programme. So there is a lot being done.
But still, the numbers of people have gone up over the last few years.
Since COVID.
I was just going to say, they did come down from a high before the pandemic. But even so, should the Home Secretary be using that sort of language when discussing this issue?
Jo, if it's true, and if the Home Secretary thinks it should be true, let me just finish the point, please, then she should be saying it. There are things which the political classes find unpalatable, which may be true, and I think it is a brave and decent Home Secretary who tries to tell the truth to people, even if some of the things that she says sound unpalatable. Right,
but the problem is a lot of people don't think it's actually true. What she said on Twitter is the British people are compassionate. We'll always support those who are genuinely homeless, but we cannot allow our streets to be taken over by rows of tents occupied by people, many of them from abroad, living on the streets as a lifestyle choice.
OK. I think if she believes there is evidence for that, she's right to say it. But let me just add one other point.
Briefly, because I must get to the others.
We also have a real issue with organised, systemic criminal begging, not only in London, but other areas. This is low-level organised crime.
Well,
and these are the things that make people, especially women, young people, at night, feel unsafe. And she's right to try to tackle these issues.
Is it right in the first instance, Jenny Chapman, in your mind, that there are some people living in tents on the streets and they're doing so as a lifestyle choice? And should that be language used by the Home Secretary?
It should not be language used by the Home Secretary. I don't think for a minute that Suella Braverman is saying this because she believes it to be true. She is saying this because she wants to get some attention and to position herself for a leadership contest within the Conservative Party that she anticipates will happen next year. That is what this is about. There is a problem with homelessness. It's gone up 75%. since the Tories took over in 2010. Under the Labour Party, prior to that, we'd reduced homelessness by 75%. And we did that by working together with organisations who seek to support people and to work on prevention of homelessness. That's where the government's focus needs to be. These kinds of statements from the Home Secretary are done to get attention, to create a storm on Twitter and to get her in the headlines. Well done, she's achieved that. But what about tackling homousness?
Do you think there are any people living in tents, living rough on the streets, that do so as a lifestyle choice?
A tiny minority. The drivers for this, we understand quite well. They're about substance misuse, they're about domestic violence, they're about relationship breakdown, they're about poverty, they're about people being evicted from their homes. Those are the things that we need to address. This sort of thing, it saddens me, it cheapens politics, and actually we need a government that rises above this and gets on with fixing the problems rather than seeking to just cause an argument.
Salma?
I think the reality, from my perspective, is somewhere the line sits between both these comments here. So I think there is a truth to the fact that if you are helping people in tents, it makes it easier for them to be outside. Homelessness, the definition of it, is broader than people who are living on the streets. This is about rough
there's sleeping
sleepers.
rough, and then there's homelessness.
So this is about rough sleepers. I think the Home Secretary is right. There is evidence to suggest that people aren't necessarily taking up local authority beds and spaces because they are able to sleep rough. Having said that, it's, I think, a poor choice of words, and it does detract from the good stuff that the government is actually doing on this. And several attempts to reduce homelessness and rough sleeping if you make it all about the language that's used.
Nancy, what do you think? Is it true in your mind that people choose to do this and that this is appropriate language for the Home Secretary to use?
It's not appropriate language. There are people who... The charities, and the irony is it's the charities who are tackling this problem. Politicians have massively failed and don't understand the scale. There are individuals in Sheffield, in Leeds, in Liverpool who the charities cannot get off the street. That is not a choice because they grew up and went, this is what I want to do. That's because they're in such a mess. It really needs tackling the root cause. I think if Suella Braverman had a choice, she would make them invisible, wouldn't she? That's what she's truly saying, because the tents draw an awful lot of attention.
Right, I mean, she's made a comparison. Just hang on, she's made...
Because we're trying to get people off the streets. That's the point of having 2.2 billion spending on this and working with local authorities. But there are people who have dysfunctional lives. And Jenny, there's mental illness as well as the list that you came out with. There are many different reasons, and we're trying to help people, but there are some people whose lives are so dysfunctional that they will keep going back onto the streets because that becomes their choice. That is over and on top of the systemic organised begging that you see in the centre of London and elsewhere, which is low-level organised crime, because it's done systemically by organised groups who have no intention of actually working.
Why doesn't she talk about that then? Why doesn't she make a statement about that? She does. She is deliberately courting attention by saying things that she knows will be divisive, and she is failing to address the underlying... She is an
antidote to the virtue signalling politicians on the left.
She seriously is not, and I'm not virtue signalling here. I am just sharing the truth, which is that there are many...
Jenny, you're sharing your opinion, which is different.
I'm sharing a truth, which is that there are many and varied... This is a multifaceted problem, and it's a complex problem, and it needs a properly led, organised approach involving partners from all sectors, because I think politicians and the voluntary sector and others working together
Jenny,
is the way to solve this.
Sorry, Jenny, that's what we have.
What you have is a 75% increase in homelessness.
Since 2010, it's come down since 2017.
That is what you have.
It's come down since 2017.
All right. Let's talk about the situation in Israel, because intense bombing has continued overnight across northern Gaza. As you can see from pictures here, the Israeli Defense Force has said it's hit 450 targets in the past 24 hours, and the IDF have said that they've reached the coast in the south of Gaza City, cutting the small strip of land in two. You can see the devastation here, and our reporter in the Gaza Strip, Rushdie Abu Alouf, has said last night's airstrikes felt like the most intense since the war began. These airstrikes that have hit the Al-Shati refugee camp, which is a town in northern Gaza. As you heard in the headlines, diplomatic efforts are continuing, with the Secretary of State, the US's top diplomat seen here, continuing his tour of the Middle East. He met his Turkish counterpart in Ankara in Turkey yesterday, and he has met with Mahmoud Abbas, president of the the Palestinian Authority. Actually, the meeting with his Turkish counterpart was after that, and they are trying to get a humanitarian pause in the fighting. Now, it's been 4 weeks since the massacre by Hamas in southern Israel, in which 1,400 people were killed. We can talk to Magen Inon, whose parents were killed in that attack. Welcome to Politics Live, Magen, and I'm sure it's still clearly very raw and very emotional for you. But if you can, just tell us about your parents.
Hi, Joe. Thank you. I had the most amazing parents. They were very modest in their ways. My dad, he's an agronomist. He was helping other farmers know what to do with their land, growing wheat and watermelon seeds and maize, various kinds of crops. And he was very, very good at his job. Even though he was somewhat semi-retired, people were still begging him to guide them. And so he kept going to the fields every day. And my mom, a very caring person. She used to be a nursery teacher and then later on taught other nursery teachers, especially around the use of art with kids. And she was the most amazing grandmother, playing with my children and her other 8 grandchildren. And we miss them. We miss them very, very much.
Well, of course you do. And it's very difficult to hear stories like yours. Your parents' village was very close to the Gaza Strip, and I know you spent time with them over the summer before this happened. When did you become aware that something was wrong on that day?
We woke up on Saturday morning. There's a 2 hours gap between London and Israel, so I have 3 kids under 7, and I'm taking the morning shift usually on Saturdays, so I was with the 3 kids. And then started getting messages on WhatsApp that something is going on in the village. First, I saw it in my family WhatsApp group. My brother and sisters are asking my parents if everything is okay. When we got a message from them that they can hear gunshots, but they're in their safe room and the house is locked. And that was the last message we got from them.
And again, you've said that your parents would want peace, you want peace, and at the moment there is war. What do you want to happen next?
It's very hard to say. I'm not an expert. I'm not a military expert, not a political expert. I want to say that we, the people who were affected in the most horrible way, we feel as if we've been abandoned. I think first abandoned by the Israeli government, with that my parents were protesting for the last year against, trying to change the government. And so we feel as if we were abandoned by the Israeli government, but now it also feels as if we're being abandoned by the international community.
And you want peace and not revenge. What did you mean by that?
I think I'm trying to be hopeful about the long-term future of the area. My parents were kind, loving people who had friends from all communities in Israel. One of my father's best friends, his name is Khalil Zayadna. He died a few years ago, but from the Bedouin community. The Zayadna family have 4 hostages now in Gaza. They have 1 family member killed by Hamas. And so when we call for peace, I try to look in the long term. In the short term, I think Hamas staying as in the leadership in Gaza is bad for all innocent lives on both sides of the border.
All right. Magen, stay with us and listen to the discussion, because we have politicians here. You said you feel let down by the international community broadly. I mean, Jenny, listening to that, the discussions here about whether to call for a ceasefire, a cessation of all hostilities right now, when the Labour leader, like the Prime Minister and the government, say that that is not possible. It wouldn't work, a ceasefire. Only a humanitarian pause can work. Have you struggled with that yourself?
I think we all have. I don't know how you can listen to a testimony like that, and I'm very grateful that he's shared that, and his parents sound like amazing people. I think we've all of us struggle with it, because we want to do and say things that will improve the situation. But the truth is, I think, that calling for a ceasefire right now, when we know that a ceasefire, for it to work, needs to be something that's agreed on both sides, is not something that is possible. And so what we're asking for is humanitarian pauses in order to get the aid and the medicines and the water into those people that desperately need it, to allow some time for the negotiation on the hostages, to allow people to leave who should leave. And this is desperately sad, and everybody is devastated by what they see coming at the images that we see coming out of Gaza. This is heartbreaking, especially so when you hear from somebody who's been so directly affected. So yes, in answer to your question, Joe, we do struggle with it, but we get to the conclusions and the positions that we think are the right ones, working in conjunction with our international partners, that will have the most positive impact on the ground and lead to de-escalation. Because in the end, we all know that this is going to be resolved only through politics, only through diplomacy, only through negotiation. That's the point that we want to get to, and as quickly as we possibly can.
Bob, what's your reaction to what you heard from Magen, first of all, and whether there can be that long-term peace that he sees?
Incredibly moving and upsetting to listen to, I have to say, so thank you. If you're asking me my opinion, I'm just speaking personally here, somebody who's done a few campaigns, but not with this intensity. I don't understand the difference in practical terms between a ceasefire and a humanitarian pause. And I think it is being used to talk about effectively civilian casualties. That is different from a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, and a humanitarian pause. And I think if you want to lower civilian casualties, which is clearly desperately in everyone's interest to do so, Israel has rules of war which it is obeying, which allow civilian casualties. Let me just finish this. So if they wanted to tighten those, to limit the use of the likely damage on civilians, that would be one option. Secondly, if you have ground forces, you are likely to produce less, it's a horrendous term, collateral damage, because if the more you rely on air power, the less you can do face-to-face soldiering effectively. And thirdly, the problem with any ceasefire, it will allow Hamas, which has its HQs underneath hospitals, which uses human beings as human shields, it will allow them to regroup. So the quickest way to reduce civilian casualties here and get to an end state, whatever that end state is to get to a soldier-led rather than air-led ground war quickly, and then for the Israelis, for the Israeli armed forces, then to tighten their casualty, effectively the casualty allowance that they give with every strike. That's a quasi-military answer.
All right. Well, I mean, Nancy, if you look at this headline, because there is a row raging within parts of the Labour Party who disagree with the leadership and Jenny's stance, and would also disagree that Israel is keeping strictly to the laws of international war. It says Burnley councillors quit party over Israel-Gaza ceasefire stance. We already know 18 frontbenchers in the Labour Party are thought to have defied their leader by calling for a cessation of hostilities, and now the leader of Burnley Borough Council has resigned along with 10 other councillors in protest at Keir Starmer's refusal to call for a ceasefire in the Gaza war, because presumably they believe that's the best way to reduce civilian casualties. What do you make of the position of the Labour leader now?
Well, I think he's in a bit of a mess, but I think he's almost backed himself into a corner, and he really doesn't want to be the one who stands alone. He's in a good, strong political position now for the election, but mainly because the Tory party is doing so abysmally in everything else. And I think it's absolutely right. We live in a country where councillors and MPs have got that decision. They can disagree and they can be safe to make those opinions, but I just think he's probably misjudged his party
I mean, I think the disagreements actually have been exaggerated within the Labour Party, and I'm someone who's been a member of the Labour Party for 30 years now, and I've seen a lot of divisions come and go, and actually what unites the Labour Party at the moment that isn't getting quite so much attention is the fact that we all want to see progress politically here. We all, I think, want to see a two-state solution. We all recognise that the eyes of the international community have not been as focused as they should be on that in recent years, and this is where that has led.
But Jenny, what do you say to those Burnley councillors? They may well be in support of a two-state solution, a Palestinian state in the West Bank area, but that they want that ceasefire. They want Keir Starmer to call for a ceasefire because they think that will reduce civilian casualties.
I know that's what they think. I disagree with them about that. I wouldn't send a message to them across their television screen today. I think that's immensely patronising of them. I respect the motive that's led them to where they have, although I fundamentally disagree that calling for a ceasefire would have the effect that they believe it would. I think it's absolutely vital for the person who wants to be the Prime Minister of this country, unlike someone who is acting in their local community as a councillor, there are different roles. The person who wants to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom needs to show that they can act on the international stage alongside President Biden, alongside the President of France, alongside other European partners in working together to influence the political solution that we know in the end is where we need, that's the point that we need to reach. And I think that Keir, yes, it's difficult, and yes, he's having to restate his case. I would encourage those councillors too to read very carefully the words of the speech that Keir made last week, because I think that laid out why he's got to where he is. And I'm saddened to see them resign, but actually there's more unity in the Labour Party at the moment than people realise.
Should MPs be allowed to debate and vote on the issue of a ceasefire, which is what many MPs would like to see?
I mean, if they want to, that is entirely up to the Speaker as to whether he's going to grant that with government business. I think we have to be realistic, though. Whether the Labour Party are having internal turmoil about this or not is irrelevant to the international situation. The only people who are going to be able to actually act and create a ceasefire are the Prime Minister of Israel with the backing of the Americans. These are the real power players here. And I think talking about domestic Labour politics is a total distraction from what actually needs to be done to prevent further civilian casualties and save these hostages and have an actual end game to what is going to happen to the situation in the Middle East.
Do you agree it's a distraction?
Absolutely. And we're hiding behind semantics, aren't we? What we need to be doing is trying to save lives. It doesn't feel like we're really doing that at all, playing politics.
Well, Bob, would you like to comment on the front page of The Sun? Fury over marches. Show some respect. This is a pro-Palestinian march being planned for Saturday on Armistice Day. Should it go ahead?
No, it shouldn't go ahead. Look, I'm all for people's rights to advertise their opinions or to advertise their foolishness in some cases. But this is a really special weekend. It's when we get to remember the dead in 2 world wars and the dead between those world wars who've served our country. There is a weekend when you shouldn't be doing this, and it is next weekend. So I'm afraid to say I'm all for freedom of speech, but Armistice Day, Armistice Weekend, an exception, and I would absolutely ban it. Can I just make a couple of other points very quickly? First, I forgot to say this. I mean, I think Maglon's parents show the power of love, and that's the only future that the Middle East and humanity has. Military options buy you time, and Israel's strategic error for the last 20 years is that it's relied on a military option to deal with a political problem. I do think now the British government needs to be working for our own sake to come up with a long-term plan and present it to Israeli and Arab friends in that part of the world and work with the Americans to see what is achievable. And finally, importantly, just on the laws of war, it's military necessity, which gives Israel the power to act, but also humanity to power to the need to limit civilian casualties. Proportionality is a debatable point.
Well, and that is exactly what we've been doing to some extent on this issue and the laws around it. But Jenny, on that, the marches, do you agree with Bob that it should be banned?
I just don't think it's appropriate when we are gathering to remember people. This isn't just about world wars anymore, either, is it? You know, most people know families that have been affected and lost people in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and we have deep respect for that and want to share in that moment of national acknowledgement of their loss. And I think to have people marching on any topic and in any way disrupting those events, I think it's completely inappropriate, and I don't think it sets the causes that those people wanting to protest about any forward at all. But mostly, I don't see. I think it's disrespectful. I hope that we don't see that.
Right, so you'd like to see the Home Secretary at least... Well, she could, of course. She does have the power herself. I know she says it's an operational matter for the police, but she could take matters into her own hand and just ban it on that day.
No, I mean, I am proud to live in a free country too, and I think there might... London is a very big place, and if people want to hold respectful demonstrations that aren't going to disrupt those important moments of commemoration, then that's something else. And I think sometimes the debate around these things gets heightened so that it's almost a challenge to protesters. Well, and I just don't think that's right.
No, well, you said that. I mean, Salma, do you agree? What do you make of Bob saying that it should be banned? Because the Palestine Solidarity campaign has said it will be, later on in the day, well after the minute's silence on Saturday, and they won't be going near Whitehall and the Cenotaph ahead of Remembrance Sunday.
Look, I don't like the idea of banning free speech or protest. I think the Home Secretary should take very seriously what she can do in order to curtail. But as you say, if the protest is respectful at a distance and after the minute's silence, then if it's contained, then perhaps that is a way to find that accommodation. However, I would just say that remembrance is more than just about the fallen. It is actually a reminder as the consequences of conflict. And if people are really serious about highlighting the plight of Palestinians, then maybe they should participate in this as part of a message to send out.
Nancy?
So I was interviewing a Sheffield woman who is 101 and her husband survived D-Day. Horrendous stories. I know it quite well. And he didn't sacrifice, and his teenage friends did not die so that people could not express their opinion about peace. And I know there is very mixed message about what these protests are for, but all the protesters I know who have taken part just want people to stop dying. And for us to say we're celebrating and remembering people while other people are allowed to die, it just didn't sit right with her. And one more thing, it tastes so bitter to me that we go, oh, it's one important day, when because of the cost of living crisis, there are veterans too scared to heat their homes, and we think we're actually protecting them. There are veterans who haven't got enough money to eat. And here we are going, one day we'll remember this is the most important day. It's ironic. Politics just twists itself. Let's show some proper respect for the veterans.
All right, Megan, you've been listening to the debate. Is there anything you would like to say or would like to hear from politicians in the UK? You've been living here a long time.
Yeah, there's something I want to say. I'm going back to this feeling of being abandoned. I want to say to everyone, including those walking in the protests here in London, especially to those hostages in Gaza, to people in the area who still hope and believe that peace and a shared life is possible. I just want to tell to everyone who respects other human beings, you're not alone. And we love you and my parents, so people, regardless of their group identity, and that's the message we want to get across. And if you're chanting out of hate, we don't want that. But if you're chanting out of love and respect and hope for long-lasting peace, we love you.
All right.
And that's my message.
Megan Innon, a very lovely way to finish. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to move on to something completely different because, as we mentioned at the beginning of the programme, it is the King's speech. The first, of course, for King Charles, happening tomorrow. And Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, said on Friday that a Labour's King's speech would rip up and bulldoze the red tape in our planning system that stops us building the infrastructure that you need. Should we be doing exactly that, Bob? Ripping up and bulldozing all the red tape that stops us building homes?
Well, we should get rid of some of it. Out of 21 amendments that the so-called NIMBYs put down in the Levelling Up Bill, 19 of them, many of them written by me and Theresa Villiers, were about how you make the system more efficient. So how you get houses above shops, how you get higher density, how we rely less on greenfield, which are very unpopular,
right.
How we actually get more affordable housing.
Well, hang on, just to interrupt, you can count, but just to interrupt, I mean, this is the headline in The Guardian, Labour promises rapid housing action after years of Tory paper promises.
Right, okay.
Is that exactly what they've been?
Let me give you two answers to that. Firstly, if you look at the actual practice of previous Conservative and previous Labour governments, previous Conservative governments build more, and we are currently building about 40,000 more houses on
well,
average.
you are now, but you know
previous
that there
Labour
haven't been
governments.
enough homes built, according to many of your colleagues.
If the Labour Party is serious about building, why is it allowing and why is it pledging to continue with the nitrates ban that is currently putting a block on 100,000 plus, 120,000 odd homes in London, in the southeast, because of this bureaucratic exercise?
Well, let Jenny
agencies.
answer that, because, funny enough, it was in the House of Lords. It was Labour Lords that stopped that, Jenny.
Yes, I was very glad to vote on that. And I noticed that the Tories actually backed off because they realised just how unpopular their position was on it. I mean, anyone who believes that the reason that the Tories have got themselves stuck on house building and are backing off all the promises that they've made over the years is because the Labour Party don't want them to pump more sewage into our rivers.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that's a credible position. And the approach we're taking
is bulldozing through. What does it mean,
well,
bulldozing through red tape? It is. It sounds like a line, but what does it actually mean?
So we just think at the moment things get. You've got piecemeal development, even on greenbelt areas. You have these sort of pockets of development. Not enough thought is put on infrastructure, planning for health services, planning for school places, and that's the reason a lot of people do get quite frustrated about planning applications near to where they live, because they know that the houses might be built and not enough thought will be put into the services that are needed to create the community that they want. So what the Labour Party is saying, look, we've got to stop that. We've got to do things in a much more planned way, give the house builders the certainty that they need, and give communities the ability to be involved in a way that says, right, the infrastructure here couldn't cope with that development. We need investment here. You know, look at school place planning, look at the provision of health services.
What's wrong with all of that, Bob? I mean, you were one of those who you were a leading rebel, weren't you, on the Conservative side to stop? Yeah. Well, allegedly, and actually, I think, in scrapping compulsory house building targets late last year. But what's wrong with what Keir started?
There's a few things. Just on point of fact, sewage has nothing to do with the nitrates argument, Jenny. So please, let's get
all right, well, let's move more broadly onto...
Right.
I want to sort of talk what it is you disagree on.
It's top-down planning targets don't work. You need to have community consent. And at the moment, we are over-focused massively on greenfield development. I'll give Nancy an example. I'll give you all an example from Nancy's home city of Sheffield, yeah? You have, according to House of Commons data, some of the lowest density in Europe. But Sheffield is not atypical because we have very low density housing by comparison with the rest of Europe. So in Sheffield, you have 1,500 people living per square kilometre. In Barcelona, it's nearer 15,000. And nobody's told me that Barcelona is a hellhole to live in. So the problem is we've got to build greater density because let me just finish one. If you rely on greenfield development, you're car dependent, it's bad for the environment, it's pretty soul-destroying places to live, you're not near services, it's not a great way to build our future. So Nancy, we need greater density in cities.
Is Bob and other of his colleagues who voted against compulsory house building targets, are they NIMBYs, not in my backyard? Does that need to stop?
I think this is the ultimate NIMBY discussion, isn't it? Because nobody actually wants anything built near their own nice, beautiful house. And Sheffield is very proud that it's the greenest city in Europe because we've got this green space. But it is also, and I hate to say it, but we agree, you're absolutely right. There are ugly, abandoned, crumbling buildings that could be turned into really good homes. But it will go against public opinion wherever you try and do it.
I'd love to come into that. May I just... One of the amendments we put down is to make it much more easy for city councils like Sheffield's to compulsory purchase, because I have hotel eyesores on the Isle of Wight, all over, Sandown and other places that we need to put in the public ownership to develop. We've heard a lot from you, Bob. Salma.
Well, I was the special advisor that advised the Secretary of State to bring in those targets. And I remember having very difficult discussions with Bob at the time. And I am very disappointed that those targets have gone, because it is not about what you build. It's about making sure that you have enough there to provide for the local community. So if you want to build in terms of gentle density, the planning still sits at a local authority level. It is just about reaching a number that is required for the way that populations grow. Now, ultimately, the thing that really makes me despair about this conversation, having done housing policy very intensely during my time in government, is that people are talking about the same stuff over and over and over again, but nothing is actually changing. Fundamentally, I've heard no conversation about the economics of housing and actually the demand side of it and how we're helping people into home ownership. And I've heard nothing about the fact that the infrastructure that exists currently actually doesn't support a lot of what the Conservatives have said previously, which I had discovered, and also I'm afraid to say, Jenny, a lot of what Labour is saying, because there is a lot that's been done around infrastructure. There's been a lot done around, ensuring that communities are able to service new populations and new sites. But ultimately, the facets of government aren't talking to each other, and it's very boring. It's not sort of retail policy, but those are the things that we need to fix before we solve this crisis.
All right, we're going to move on and have a look at this headline in The Independent. Politicians are using culture war as distraction tactic, poll finds. It's the latest research conducted by King's College London and Ipsos UK, and we can now talk to Kelly Beaver, who's Chief Executive of Ipsos. Kelly, the culture wars terminology has been used by politicians and in the media in recent years. What do you mean by it?
So culture wars is about conflicts between groups, normally liberal conservative groups that have different ideals, beliefs, philosophies. And the study itself looks at both media mentions and media coverage of culture wars terms, the term itself, cancel culture, for example, but it also looks at the public's attention, understanding and belief that a culture war is taking place in the UK. And so it does both of those things. And we have seen since 2020, in the 3 years that we've been tracking this, growth in a focus on culture wars as an issue, both in the media, but also amongst the general public. They are increasingly aware of culture wars as a topic, and they're also increasingly likely to think that politicians are inventing and exaggerating culture wars in order to serve as a political tactic.
Can you give us some examples of the issues themselves?
Yeah, so some of the issues that you might see, race relations, transgender, free speech, women's rights, some of those types of topics would be considered cultural ideologies, beliefs, and those are some of the key topics that you may have also seen come up in political debates over the last 12 to 18 months.
Right, why do voters feel they're exaggerated?
So there are a couple of reasons why they think politicians are exaggerating. One of them is because they think politicians are trying to distract people from more important topics. And one of the others is that they believe that it's actually in the politicians' interest to exaggerate divisions over cultural issues. But what that does, of course, and the public recognise that, it also divides society further rather than highlights how it can be improved.
Right.
It's politicians, though, Joe, it's also the media. 7 in 10 say that they feel the media exaggerate the issues too.
Right. It's a distraction. Politicians, perhaps like you, Bob and Jenny, have used it as a distraction and actually exaggerate them. Bob?
I don't quite buy that argument because I think, look, politicians talk about stuff they think resonates and stuff they think they're interested in, and that's a fact of life. And if you don't want to talk about culture wars, let's talk in terms of values. The reason why Jenny maybe lost her seat at the last election, despite no doubt trying her best, was because her values and the values of the Labour Party did not align with the good people of Darlington and indeed elsewhere in the country.
All right, well, let Jenny respond, because that's quite a thing to say
right,
to her.
That is quite a big thing to say.
Well, no, maybe,
Speaking as a person of Darlington who's lived there a whole life and kids were born there and all of that, I mean, I think that it's absolutely a distraction, and I think that parents. I think because we live in a democracy. I think that...
Hang on, Bob. Hang on. Let her finish.
I think the public have got this right. I think that politicians do use these issues as a distraction. What people are interested in is the fact that we've got mortgages. People are paying hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month more for their mortgage. They're frustrated with the criminal justice system and delays in courts. They're really annoyed about the fact that millions of people are on waiting lists for health services. And they want a government that's going to do something about it. And what do they get? They get the Prime Minister sitting around with Elon Musk and then making comments about men and women and all the rest of it at conference. They get Suella Braverman yappering on about tents and God knows what else, because they're determined to talk about anything other than the real issues, the day-to-day issues facing people of this country. And I think it's so sad, and I'm very, very glad that the public is seeing through it.
What does it mean for the next election?
I think it's all about dividing lines, and this is political strategy. And 100%. I think as soon as you move in certain places, actually you are trying to pincer the opposition on certain things as well. So, for example, if you're talking about trans issues, the fact that there was a lot of backlash on the Labour benches against Keir Starmer's position on the trans issue, just as much as there'll be a lot of problems with Rishi Sunak talking about a woman being a woman and a man being a man. So I think the problem with culture wars is that you never quite know how it's going to play out. And fundamentally, and I mean this is the nice possible way, it is the economy, stupid. So where you kind of like put the onus on cultural issues versus economic issues is a strategic question.
Are they important to readers, Nancy, culture war issues?
I think people enjoy talking about them. We all enjoy talking about it. It's what you talk about when you go down the pub, if anybody still goes down the pub these days, if they haven't all shut. But it's
we all still go down.
But it's not the stuff that actually people are going to vote on, is it? It's not what's keeping the houses warm, all that debate. But I also do think that it is sometimes used by politicians because it covers all that up. Because we don't have to talk about the boring stuff that actually is real everyday life.
Right, Bob.
Okay, the boring stuff is really important. Crime is really important. Mortgages is really important. Economics is really important, which is why Rishi has endlessly talked about getting inflation down, etc. So the idea that this government is ignoring it is for the birds. Values matter to people as well because they want to know who they're electing. And if you don't believe that values are important, can somebody explain to me why the SNP government collapsed so quickly after the gender recognition bill? I get the fact that they were in power a long time.
But let's go to your point. Let's go to your point about values matter. I mean, that is true. And there was, and there have been great attempts by Keir Starmer, in a word, to correct some of the value judgments that people made about Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, completely. It was a disaster, Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, for politics in this country. It was a complete disaster. And Keir Starmer has done a successful job at correcting that. Values do matter, but so does competence. And so does actually keeping to your promises and delivering what you say you're going to do. And I think when people are looking at Rishi Sunak flailing around, reaching for any subject he can, I don't think anyone believes that Rishi Sunak is completely motivated by culture wars. They see him reaching for it as a political tool. That's what they see.
Sorry, Jen,
and they see,
not,
and they
values,
see, and Bob, you've spoken a lot.
The values of the Conservative Party, at the last election, we're looking after the North, we're levelling up, we're making Brexit work for us. So actually, is it real values, or are we all discussing things that in the end they're just winning votes?
Are you talking about policies, Nancy? Were you talking about policies, Nancy, or values?
I'm talking about both.
Okay.
Surely levelling up is a value as well, believing that you should take wealth from London and spread it across. Where's it gone?
I'll tell you, you're talking to a person who represents a constituency in southern England that's absolutely part of that levelling up agenda. What it's gone in is, on the Isle of Wight, is a new railway, effective rejig railway. We've got $6 million for a heavy.
All right, well, let's not do a whole marketing thing in the Isle of Wight. But Salma, on the issue of where the values and where the money has gone, perhaps on things like levelling up, which was promised.
But this is semantics that is just around this table. Everybody's got a different view of what we're going to do, and now there's like a culture war between this panel about like what is actually an economic policy versus a value and all the rest of it. Obviously, all politicians are supposed to be driven by a set of values. They're driven by an ideology. They're driven by whatever sort of marketing wrapper they put around what kind of Conservative or Labour Party member they are, or whatever that might be. But the proof is in the pudding, which is how are they actually driving those policies? What do they actually mean? So you can't separate values from policy. It's all going to be mashed together. But having said that, as cynical as I am, having been in politics for a very long time, it's not just about the electioneering. It is the tone. It is kind of like buying into people. And that's what everybody's going to try and do. And that's not without its cynicism. There is, kind of portrayal of what you want people to think of you. But that's just politics.
Well, Kelly Beaver, just sort of yes or no, do you think it's going to be a big issue at the next election?
No, I don't. I think the big issues are cost of living, NHS, and actually for Conservative voters, small boat crossings are a big issue.
All right, Kelly Beaver from Ipsos, thank you very much for joining us. And I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. And, of course, that will follow on from the unveiling of the King's speech tomorrow from about 10:30 on BBC One. Switch straight over to BBC Two. From all of us here, bye-bye.